Welcome to the Intersection Collective podcast. This is a space for parents, grandparents, aunties, uncles, anybody in the village who finds themselves advocating for the educational opportunities for an exceptional student at the intersection of race and disability. Thank you for taking the time to rejoin us here at the Intersection Collective. I am joined in the studio today by State Representative Dani Isaacsohn. You are now, your bio says you're serving your first term, but you got reelected recently. So
that both are true. Yeah, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for taking some time to join us. Not only are you a state representative for House District 24, which is most of Cincinnati.
Just under half the city.
Under half of the city. Okay, love that. But specifically, you serve on lots of House committees. And the one that's really interesting to us in this conversation is you are the ranking member on the Finance Subcommittee for Elementary and Secondary Education.
Yes. Guilty
as charged.
I love that role. I'm very grateful to have it.
In addition to your work as a state representative, you are also the founder of Cohere.
Yep, I did that I moved back to Cincinnati to start of 2017 and started Cohere and then did that until taking this job.
Okay, so Cohere, for folks who aren't familiar, don't know, is a business, it's a not-for-profit organization that focuses on community organizing and connecting people with lived expertise with decision makers, business leaders, elected leaders, to facilitate dialogue and conversation and information exchange. Is that fair?
A very fair summary. Yeah, the basic premise is people who live the issues every day have expertise. So if you're the head of Metro or the superintendent of Cincinnati Public and you want to learn about how to improve the bus system for seniors or how to end bullying for elementary school students, who are the experts? Seniors who ride the bus or who are maybe thinking about stopping, kids in schools who are dealing with bullying, right? That's who leaders and policymakers need to hear from, in addition to the academic experts and professional experts, but that culture of engagement and actually learning from the everyday experts is what sort of I think Cohere brings to the table and what I loved doing for 7 years.
7 years. I love that. And so why that expertise I feel like is really relevant and interesting to me for this conversation is twofold. We want to understand better how education in the state of Ohio is funded. Really interested to have this conversation with you and to pull forward those two buckets of your expertise. Because the Intersection Collective organizes communities at the intersection of race and disability and provides resources to support those families in their pursuit of educational excellence or educational equality for their exceptional students. So a big part of our audience, a big part of our work really digs deep into how do we get access to resources that are intended to support exceptional students? How do we make, the ideals of IDEA a thing, a practical thing? How do we ensure that FAPE is not just something on paper, but is actually a lived experience for our kids? And my argument, my belief is that a big part of how we ensure that all of those things are true is by building collective power and by building a community, a village to help not only facilitate the passage of information, but to make sure that decision makers understand how these policies and laws actually impact our day-to-day lives, impact the day-to-day lives and the experiences of our kids. So I think you have a lot of expertise. That can be really helpful.
I'm excited to chat.
All right, so let's dig into it. Start from the very beginning and assume we know absolutely nothing, because it's true. We know absolutely nothing. What is the state's budget for education? It's like how much money is actually spent in the state of Ohio on elementary and secondary education?
Well, let's back up a little.
Okay.
And just so the the line I was told when I was entering the legislature, which is sort of everyone's go-to, is that the state funds primarily three things. The state is there to medicate, incarcerate, and educate. Now, I am pushing hard for us to at least change it to medicate, rehabilitate, and educate, because that is presumably the premise of our system, our correctional system. But either way, it gives you a sense of roughly how the budget is delineated. And within Medicaid, which is sort of what the Medicaid piece covers, the federal government is putting forward a lot of that money. And so the state is making some decisions, but the largest bucket of state dollars is in education. Okay. And, we're talking about a $10 billion budget.
For the state of Ohio.
Give or take.
Wow.
And so it's overall, it's about a $100 billion budget, but kind of how it gets sliced every year is different, and how much of it is coming from the federal government. Are those state dollars? They get used as state dollars, but they're not emanating from the state. But the $10 billion in education, those are state operating budget, general revenue fund dollars.
Okay.
We had in the 90s a series of Supreme Court decisions that were cases that were brought, called the DeRolf decisions, from primarily actually the plaintiffs bringing the cases were from Southeast Ohio, from Appalachia. And they were arguing that our system for funding schools was unconstitutional. Okay. Because the Ohio Constitution clearly states that schools need to be funded equally and fairly. And they were making the case that there is not an equal and fair distribution of funding for schools. And over again, over 4 decisions, the Supreme Court sided with the plaintiffs and found that the Ohio State school funding system was unconstitutional.
Because it was unfair. It was inequitable.
It was not doing either of the two things that it needed to be doing. Okay. It wasn't fairly distributing the funds or equitably distributing them.
Okay.
And so since then, the last 25, 30 years has been a mission for the state to, can we constitutionally fund our public schools? And to their great credit, long before I was in the legislature, about 6 years ago, a little more, between 6 and 8 years ago, a group of Democrats and Republicans got together and tried to really hammer out what is a funding formula that could provide some objectivity to how we fund our schools and would meet the constitutional requirements. Okay. So that it's not this ad hoc, little bit here, a little bit there. Well, these schools are struggling. Let's plaster on some funding here, which is what it had become. Okay. And they, Bob Cupp, who eventually became the Speaker of the House, and John Patterson as the Democrat, came up with the Cupp-Patterson formula. Now it's known as the Fair School Funding Formula. And that was adopted 6 years ago as 4 years ago, as the sort of funding formula for our schools. And the idea behind it is, once fully funded, okay, it would meet the constitutional requirements. Now, you'd have to put it up to the Supreme Court to actually determine whether that's true, but that's the idea. And so everything we have now is within the Fair School Funding Formula, but it's got a phased-in funding approach. Okay. Which means that every 2 years, when the state does its operating budget, which we're getting ready to do in early 2025, the legislature is deciding, are we going to continue funding the Fair School Funding Formula? We are currently in year 4. So one of the greatest accomplishments I think we had in the General Assembly during my time is that last year during the budget, we chose to fund years 3 and 4 to continue the Fair School Funding Formula. Okay. And we adjusted for inflation. That's not the actual term, is we adjusted the input years so that we'll get into this in a minute, but we adjusted for inflation is the short version. Okay. So those are the two big choices we had to make 2 years ago. It was a big fight. Democrats basically used all of our leverage to get those 2 wins. Yes. We're talking about an extra over $1 billion.
Very important.
And so now going into next year, the question is, will we do it again? Will we fund years 5 and 6, which would take us to 100% of the Fair School Fund, so it would be fully phased in. And will we adjust for inflation again?
Okay.
Again, it's probably not quite as expensive this time because inflation hasn't jumped as high. Mm-hmm. But it's still, we're talking about, north of $1 billion over the course of the 2 years in additional spending to do that.
Okay.
So we can dive into the actual substance of the formula whenever you want, but big picture, that's sort of where things are with school funding.
Got you. $10 million is a huge budget.
Yep.
When we think about equitable distribution, so the equitable distribution of those resources, I understand that this particular Supreme Court decision and these particular investments were intended to improve that. Ohio still has a pretty long way to go. If you look at the 50 states and kind of do quick Googles, like give me the states with the most and the least equitable public school funding formulas. Ohio's not like top 5, top 10. We struggle. We're in fact kind of below the 25 mark. We're like less than half.
Yep.
So there's a lot of opportunity to improve. So my question really is, when I think about who's most impacted by lack of resources, it's oftentimes urban, rural, disability populations that kind of get the horn from the bull. Is this true in our current system that the places where we need to do better, urban, rural, are exceptional students? And if so, like, what's the plan? Like, what are folks in the House, what are folks in your committee doing to try to solve those problems?
Okay, there's a lot there. First of all, I agree with the premise of the question. Mm-hmm. I think it's the right question to ask. I also want to say, it's been 18 months since I looked at the specific budget number. So if $10 billion is off, don't hold me to it.
We're not fact checking you here, Representative. You're fine. You're fine.
But in terms of what you're describing, I mean, I think what's important to note is, one, our funding sources is primarily property taxes at the local level.
Right.
So one of the things that is driving the inequity is that property taxes and just relative wealth still play such a huge role. Yeah. So before I answer your question about how that disparity shows up, it's helpful to just give you a sense of how the funding formula is structured.
Okay.
So it's based on the idea that first you need to calculate what does it cost to educate the average child in Ohio.
Correct.
And once you do that, then you determine, okay, how much does it cost for these additional costs? So how much does it cost to educate an English language learner? Yeah. How much does it cost to educate someone from an economically disadvantaged background, someone with special education needs, with physical or other sort of disabilities? What are the additional costs on average? Mm-hmm. And then you're looking at, okay, within each district, how many of their students within each category do they have compared to the statewide average? Mm-hmm. Do they have more English language learners or fewer in that district than the statewide average? So that's on the cost side. And there's a lot of inputs into what does it cost to educate, from teacher salaries and that's where the student-teacher ratios come in, to the cost of supplies, and all of those are sort of baked in. So when I say adjust for inflation, like we talked about earlier, it's on the cost input side of the formula.
Okay.
Are we adjusting the inputs for what they cost now versus what they used to cost? Then you're looking at, okay, given the cost, how much is the state paying and how much should the local district be on the hook for? So what's the state share versus the local share? And to calculate that, and this is one of the areas where the equity question arises, is you're looking at how wealthy is the district? Mm-hmm. And the way that is calculated is it's 60% property taxes and property values and 40% income. Okay. So the wealthier districts are getting a smaller share of state dollars, and they are responsible for a greater percentage of the cost of educating a child. The minimum that the state can give to a district is 10%. Okay. So, I'll use an example some Cincinnati folks would be familiar with. In Indian Hill, which is the wealthiest school district in the state is paying for 10% of the public education, and Indian Hill is on the hook for 90%, and they're using property taxes to pay for that. primarily, whereas in the lowest income parts, that could be flipped.
Gotcha.
Cincinnati, because it includes downtown and has relatively high property values, is actually seen as a relatively wealthy district, the city of Cincinnati.
Okay.
So it's about a 40-60 split, where the district is on the hook for close to 60%, which is, that's the school levies and the other things that people are familiar with.
Correct.
So the way inequities show up for the communities you're talking about happens in two different ways. One is on the input side, which is, are we accurately accounting for the cost of educating those students? Because if we're under accounting that on the input side of the formula, then the cost of having X amount of economically disadvantaged students there's going to be an undervaluation there.
Yeah.
So the overall spend is going to be too little.
Right.
So that's one way that it could show up, and is. The other is on the fact that we're using property values and relative wealth, because not every student in Cincinnati goes to Cincinnati Public Schools. And one of the reasons it costs more to educate economically disadvantaged students in particular, and English language learners, is because at scale, the costs become greater. So having one economically disadvantaged student in a school versus having 90% of the students come from that background doesn't have the same cost implications. Mm-hmm. And we have to find a way to try and take that into account on the relative wealth of the district as well. Mm-hmm. But for what we are working on is, particularly, can we adjust the input side of the formula so that it is at least accurate? And the way that happens, the state hires consultants and they look into how much does it cost to educate an English language learner nationally? How much does it cost in the best programs in Ohio for each of the categories?
Okay.
And last year, one of the fights, again, that we pushed really hard for and that we ended up winning in the budget was to fund a study to properly look into what does it cost to educate a student from an economically disadvantaged background.
Okay.
DPIA is what that is, sort of the acronym for that. The study has not produced its results, but I can tell you just right now, looking at other parts of the country, we are massively underfunding that piece of the formula.
Okay.
We are not even coming close to properly accounting for what it would take to provide an excellent education for schools with high percentages of lower income students.
So give us some dollars and cents there. Right now, like the formula that we're currently under assumes it costs what to educate a student from an economically disadvantaged background relative to what a state that's probably closer to accurate says.
I'll give you the percentages only because
It's been a while.
Well, it's only been, I wish I could tell you it's been a while. I've been in these negotiations for the last couple of weeks, so it's only been a week. But the number is sort of, I don't want to get it wrong, and so I'd rather not guess. But it's somewhere in the $1,000 to $2,000 additional range.
Okay.
So the average sort of state share is around $8,000.
Okay.
Just for the cost of the average student, and that puts the average cost to educate a student around $14,000-$15,000.
Okay.
And in Cincinnati, at least. And so, what you're looking at is what's the relative percentage increase, and the most conservative studies are that it costs about 30% more to educate a student from a economically disadvantaged background. Okay. And that's one student.
Okay.
But the numbers I like to use are giving you district comparisons, and I'll stick with Indian Hill because it's an excellent school district, and I'm picking on them just out of love, not they're not doing anything wrong. Yeah. But that's a school district where they're spending north of $25,000 per pupil to provide excellent education to students from Indian Hill. Now, that's what they have determined they think it costs to provide a great education for their students. Do you think it would cost more or less to provide an equivalent education for students from the inner city of Akron, Cincinnati, or Cleveland? or frankly, for that matter, students from rural Southeast Ohio and Appalachia.
I think it would cost much more.
Way more.
Much more, yeah.
They're not all coming from two-parent households. They're not all getting exposed to the same amount of books and reading at home. They're not all coming into kindergarten with the same early childhood quality education. They don't all have access to tutors and resources. And so there's all sorts of reasons why it would be more expensive in places where schools have high percentages of students who not only come from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, but have been exposed to violence and trauma and all sorts of other things.
Correct.
And yet we are not spending anywhere near that amount of money in those schools.
Yeah.
And so you can just see by comparison that how can we expect to provide a world-class education or even an excellent education when Indian Hill is telling us it costs $25,000 per student in Indian Hill to get to that level of education. Now, I'm not saying money is the only answer or that money will solve all of our problems. I think there's plenty of examples that people can find and do find where they spent tons of money and it didn't produce the results that we wanted.
Correct.
So, but it is a necessary but not sufficient condition. Okay. You can't do it without the money.
Correct.
But the money's not going to do it for you.
Correct.
And right now we are underfunding schools, particularly in our urban areas and in our Appalachian communities. And so I am trying really hard, and this will get to the organizing side of things, to build a coalition, a connection between our urban and our Appalachian communities. And actually a couple months ago organized the inaugural Urban Appalachian Education Summit to bring together students, teachers, principals, and superintendents from urban districts across the state and Appalachian districts across the state for a day-long summit to meet each other, build relationships, but also try and develop a shared advocacy agenda.
Yeah, super important. I definitely want to go there because, and we've talked quite a bit about students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. Hugely important. Also want to throw into the mix English language learners and students with disabilities, or exceptional learners. Specifically for the intersection collective community, that's where we live.
Sorry,
right?
yes. Let's go there.
At the intersection of race and disability on purpose. Like we're camping out there on purpose because that is the population of students where we see disproportionality, just defining that as a term, where we see educational attainment outcomes lagging far behind their English-speaking, white, similarly abled peers. And we also see the cultural capital, meaning the ability of their familial caregiver, their familial advocate to influence decisions and outcomes with educators, building administrators is diminished. And it definitely seems to be an issue that breaks around culture and race specifically, because even if you have a person who is Black, or let's say Afro-Latina, but very well educated, not at all economically disadvantaged, maybe, economically advantaged, that person's ability to influence the outcome of a special education school sanctioned conversation or negotiation with their school is less than a white mom who, let's say, has a GED and is in fact economically disadvantaged. That person is more effective because they are finding privilege in culture and language, and they're finding privilege in race. Yeah. So when we think about resourcing necessary for ensuring a fair and appropriate education, or free and appropriate education, FAPE, for students who do not speak English as a primary language and students who do have a disability, we really need to find ways to more meaningfully engage their advocates, more meaningfully engage their families. In Cincinnati, the interim superintendent shared very recently at an LSDMC meeting that the fastest enrolling student population for CPS right now is multilingual learners.
I spent my morning with some of them.
Fantastic. And that currently CPS sees 22% of their students with special education needs, either having an IEP or 504. That doesn't account for students who are undiagnosed or students who are still waiting for evaluation to be diagnosed, but 22%, which is higher than the state average. So we are seeing an increase in those two populations. So let's better understand how funding moves and how funding is calculated, or what it costs to educate these students is calculated from the model that you all are using and in the conversations that you are having around budget and policy issues.
So it's the same mechanism. There's an additional line item in the funding formula for what is the average cost to educate each of those populations, and then how does that district compare to the statewide average? And then based on that ratio, you're getting a certain additional allocation per student. And again, but that additional allocation is broken up by the state share of it and the local share. And so the funding formula was initially conceived where it was meant to be about a 50-50 breakdown on average. Okay. 50% of public education funding in the state would come from state government and 50% would be coming from local government. Because it's so reliant on property values, and because property values have spiked in the last few years, the local share is going higher and higher. So while it was initially conceived to be 50-50, it's actually likely to be closer to 60-40, if not 62-38, this upcoming budget. Okay. Which is a huge shift, putting the burden on local communities. And actually most school levies failed this year because people, even if they don't know it, they know it, right? Even if they don't know what exactly is happening, they know the burden, that you can feel the burden is heavier. And it's getting harder and harder to pass school levies locally because too much of the burden is falling on local communities to fund this. And so it plays into each of the lines of the budget. Okay. And so if you have greater local share, right, you need to come up with, that's just what you're responsible for. You then have to go out and get it. Right. And there's plenty of districts, mostly in rural areas, that's where these levies are failing. And part of it is a lot of these, particularly Appalachian communities, they don't have the property tax base. So you can increase the amount, but your base is too small. A lot of these communities, their schools were built on the backs of coal plants. That's what was funding their school systems. And so as those have shut down, there's just nowhere to turn for the money. And either it's going to come from the state or it's not going to come at all. And which are the first? We all know the first programs to get cut. They're programs for exceptional students. They're programs for English language learners. Because exactly for the reason you described, they have the least ability to push back and to advocate and to raise complaints about it. And so there is a direct tie to those choices that are made and people's organizing power. Yeah.
So let's talk about that, Rep. Isaacsohn. It's like the work of the Intersection Collective really is a melding together of culturally responsive advocacy training for families and community organizing training and community organizing support. Our theory of change is that we can build a community of critical supporters connected to a school, such that any family that comes in and out of that particular school can ally themselves with other families in that building who are also supporting exceptional students. And that together we have a more powerful voice, that we have more cultural capital together than we would have in isolation. One, and then two, information also trades more freely because we've created a container. We've created a safe space where you can go and plead total ignorance and say, like, I don't know, I need help, like point me in the right direction of fill in the blank. It's a safe space for that. And so we believe that these villages, these school-based villages, will help not only democratize how information moves, but also help these families increase their confidence, thereby increasing their effectiveness as advocates. So if we've got this organized body of families within a building, and then we connect them to other organized families within a building, now we've got organized families across the city that all have one thing in common. We have exceptional students that we are advocating for. Where is that firepower best directed? And what are the opportunities for these organized communities to influence the decisions that folks like you are making?
I love the direction of this, and I'm all in for the theory of change.
Okay.
I've been community organizing in some form or fashion for the last 12 years, so I'm here for it. I'll speak mostly to the way families can advocate at the state level.
Yes.
I have some thoughts on how to do it at the school or district level, but it's a little less. Some of it is work I was doing before this, but for now, we go through the operating budget every 2 years, and it happens from the governor submits what he wants the budget to be in early February, and then it goes to the House. The House has it for a couple months. We come up with whatever we think our version is, and then we send it to the Senate. I'm using we liberally here. The Republicans have supermajorities in both chambers. So as a Democrat, we do what we can to try and influence it. And then by June, it has to be done by the end of June. And so in that process, there's a lot of lobbying and advocacy that happens.
Okay.
And we do hear from parent groups. Usually they have they have already done the work of grouping themselves together. They're not coming as individuals.
Yes.
Right? They have an association. If they've been doing it a while, they have a lobbyist, often a Columbus-based lobbyist who knows the process. And they're meeting with members of the Finance Committee to make their case, and they're showing up to testify, and they're giving their personal stories, and they're choosing the most compelling cases. And we do hear from those folks. It's usually from the charter school communities, from the private school communities who have received north of, at this point, billions of dollars in state subsidies or direct state funding for charter schools. And we don't hear that much from any public school parents, but especially not from the parents in the communities you're talking about, which means you can see that as a problem, which it obviously is, but that means an opportunity.
Yeah.
And it will take time to build that up and for people to get used to that advocacy. But I'll just give you one small example. In the operating budget, there's often earmarks for individual nonprofits. It's not my favorite system. I pushed back pretty hard against it when I first got there. But you got to pick your battles, and this is how the budget works. So there's always going to be or at least for the moment, it seems there'll be earmarks for individual nonprofits. There's one nonprofit that is a basketball league for students with who are differently abled physically. Mm-hmm. And they do an incredible job of advocacy. They bring the students. I still remember sort of in vivid detail the meeting in my office that I had with the two students and the founder and one of their parents, the founder of the league. Incredibly effective video. And look, who doesn't want that for kids? These kids should get to play basketball. Mm-hmm. They get funding every year for that nonprofit league. It's not through the state school system. It's through that organization. But they're working the system, and they're doing a great job of advocating. And now I know that they're going to come to my office next year. Mm-hmm. They're part of the culture of the budget process. That's what parents need to do, is as a collective group, become part of you got to dive into Columbus. And Cincinnati, actually, because of our distance and because we kind of see ourselves as a city-state down here in Southwest Ohio, mm-hmm. we don't engage Columbus in the State House nearly as much as particularly Cleveland, but some of the other cities do. Columbus, because it's there. And so I'm working really hard to change that. It's one of my goals as the representative from the city is to try and change that culture. Cincinnati needs to be showing up in Columbus at the State House. And then the other piece I would say, and this is advocacy advice that I try and give folks on any issue, is that Democrats are not in charge. We are your allies on most of these issues, but we're not in charge. And so Democrats can't unilaterally, usually, put something into the budget or get a bill passed. We need Republicans to support it.
Yeah.
So I view my job is I'm constantly building relationships and trust with Republicans. Because if I want to get anything done, I need to work with them. I don't have the luxury of just running with my ideas and trusting that, I have the votes. So every major thing I do, I try and find a bipartisan joint sponsor, and then I got to win over Republicans to the cause. And so for advocates and for parents coming in, the more you can do on the front end to build connections and partnerships and build power with folks who are represented by Republicans, so that by the time you're coming to Columbus, you're coming together and you're requesting a joint meeting. You're not just meeting with me. You want to meet with me and whoever's representing them from the other party. Now I've got a natural built-in ally on this issue because you've done a lot of the work for me. You've sent us a joint email. You've scheduled a joint meeting. Now I know who to work with. And I don't need to convince them. Their constituents were just in their office. I heard them. Right. So one of the first things I did was when I got this role on the education committee, I started visiting schools. I've been working with Cincinnati Public, and I'm a Cincinnati Public graduate. And so I wasn't visiting schools in Cincinnati. I went to Appalachia and started visiting Appalachian schools because not only do those schools need some of the same supports and have some of the same challenges, they are represented by the majority. And at the time, they were represented by the folks in the majority who were in power. Yeah. And I invited their students to come testify in addition to Cincinnati Public students. And I invited their superintendent and their principal to come testify. Because we have to build that bridge. We are not, urban districts in particular, and urban representatives cannot do this alone. We just don't have the numbers.
Right.
So we have to find connection somewhere.
For coalition building opportunities. And
the more that coalition building happens in the grassroots level, the better. There's real power there. Okay. And at the state level.
Yes.
Because public education there's no doubt about it, it's under attack in Ohio. And it's particularly acute for the populations most in need, which are the populations I think that you're focused on. And that is going to, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, that's going to get worse in the next few years because of some of the leadership changes that have happened in the Republican Party recently. And so we need to be building coalitions and building power and getting ready and pushing back.
Talk about what that looks like, though, the building power and the building coalitions and the pushing back looks like specifically for families coming from communities of color, English language learning communities. Our central issue is educational equity for exceptional learners. Like, that's our common issue. But if I keep the same mom that we talked about in my prior example, like Afro-Latina mom, very well educated, well employed, so my time is limited. How am I best using the time and the energy that I do have in the coalition building and in the advocacy process, assuming that, groups like the Intersection Collective are going to help put us in, I liked how you said it, it's just part of the zeitgeist. It's just part of the funding process that this basketball league is going to show up. We need to have organizations like the Intersection Collective that are just part of the zeitgeist, that every time the finance committee is going through procedural steps, like, we're showing up, like we're a presence there. But like, how are your community organizing strategies different based on this population? Like, what does this population specifically need to do in order to maximize their effectiveness in a limited amount of time?
My background is in relational organizing. There's different schools. That is the type of organizing I learned. and have always practiced, which is exactly like it sounds. It's based on relationships.
Yeah. Same.
And so
It's like Marshall Gant School of Organizing.
Totally. And that has morphed over it has evolved, and relational organizing has evolved with it, which is great. And so that means you need relationships with parents who come from different backgrounds, who come from different kinds of schools, different kinds of districts. You need access to personal stories and people who are good at telling them and have training in how to share their personal story. And you need relationships with your elected officials. And that just like all relationships, takes time. And you can start with your elected officials. People in Cincinnati can start with me or Representative Denson or Representative Thomas or the state senator Ingram, who's been in these spaces for a long time and knows them well. And then it can expand to, okay, who are some other representatives we might be able to build relationships with? For example, there's a representative from the greater Cincinnati area. He's termed out, so he's leaving, but I'll just giving you an example of sort of what's possible. He is deeply committed to communities with exceptional needs and differently abled communities because he has someone in his family. He's an incredible advocate for those communities. He's incredibly conservative on so many issues, but on this issue, he's been a champion. And you can find that out by starts with the relationship with your representative, and now I can give you some insight.
Correct.
And I can help you come up with what's a strategy here. And then we can work together on, let's go find some other folks who are passionate about this. And then it's playing at the state level, it's playing the long game.
Yeah.
It does not happen for the reasons you described when you described those two parents, right? Some people get quick fixes and some people get immediate access. But for the issues we're talking about, the communities we're talking about, they know better than anyone. That is not how it works. It takes years of grinding to get these wins and of convincing people and making the case and winning people over. And I think having that mindset from the beginning can really help. And just slowly but surely increasing the amount of people involved. I really do believe this is an issue we can make progress on. I would tell you if I thought this was like, gun reform, where the majority party is dead set against it, and I don't care how popular it is, special interests have them locked in and they won't do anything on the issue. Most representatives don't understand these issues. Most of the representatives don't understand how our school funding system works. It is, and granted, it's complicated. So there's so much education that goes into it. So when you get them in front of a group of their constituents, and their constituents are explaining to them how broken the system is, how hard it is to advocate for themselves within the current system, not everyone, but a lot of their eyes will open up. So you have to spark them to care about it. And to spark them to care about it, they have to know about it.
Correct.
And for them to know about it, you have to have a relationship with them, or someone has to have a relationship with them.
So talk us through, and I'll land the jet after this question, but can you talk us through the calendar? So you mentioned before that you would need to have an advocacy group that is just on the calendar. They're just constantly and consistently part of the dialogue when you are making school finance decisions. Talk us through that calendar. Like, what does that look like? Does that look like once a quarter? Like, we're sending groups of parents with personal stories, groups of students to your office. Does it look like, in the summer? Like, what does this look like? What are the high impact moments?
So the General Assembly has a 2-year calendar. And I mentioned the budget calendar before. So the first 6 months of the first year and the 2 years are the operating budget. And it's a frenzied time, and then sort of a summer break. And then you come back and you work on mostly just kind of other kinds of legislation. And then that fall, the fall of the odd numbered years, we begin the capital budget process. And that's when individual local governments, townships, cities, municipalities, and nonprofit organizations can submit capital budget requests. It's also when we do school facilities funding. And that then happens in the beginning of the even number years. That's when the capital budget process is. And then usually that summer there's sort of a break to campaign. And then we come back for what we're in now, which is lame duck session, which is when people are trying to jam through all the bills that hadn't made it through across the finish line yet. And because it's the holidays, people are paying less attention. It's when some of the more controversial things sometimes come up. Okay. So that's broadly the 2-year calendar. So in the even years, it's the best time to be building those relationships, because in the odd years is when the budget is that's when you're trying to
get your earmarks,
cash in on the relationship, right? And really advocate for, cash in, I'm using tongue in cheek, but advocate for whatever that issue is. And you want the relationship before then, ideally.
Correct.
So it's not that you're necessarily advocating hard before then. It's just that that's when you're building the relationship. That's when you're inviting the representative for tours. That's when you're sitting them down and sharing your story. That's when you're getting to know them. That's when you're introducing them to students. And one of the things I try and do as an advocate is whenever I go to other schools or visit other communities, I invite the local representative. Because I want them to see what I see and hear what I hear, so that when we're back in the legislature, I can reference it. When I say we need to increase this line item, don't you remember what that kid said? Don't you remember when those students said that if they were in a fishing club, it would have saved their classmate's life because he would have had some friends? This is the line item in the budget that funds things like that. So the off season sort of there is no real off season, but the off season in terms of the budget allows for better advocacy during the budget process.
Okay.
And I will say just, this is not my favorite part of the process. In fact, the process in general is in deep need of reform. But again, Republicans are in charge, so I don't get to choose that. My job is to try and make the biggest impact for the people I represent and people across Ohio, given the constraints of the system that I don't control.
Okay.
But lobbyists help. We have term limits, so you can only do 8 consecutive years in either chamber.
Okay.
So often what happens is actually lobbyists have the most institutional knowledge. They've been there 30 years. They know what the school funding fights that have been going on for the last few decades. And they can be really helpful. Again, I can think of better designed systems for representative democracy, but we've got what we've got.
For now,
and I want the communities that I'm fighting for to have a fair shot.
Right.
And so I'm just trying to give, as I see it, sort of helpful, practical thoughts.
Building coalitions is item number 1. Focusing on building relationships in the even years, and potentially adding a lobbyist to the payroll to get us over the finish line.
I'm not willing to go on the record and say that someone should hire a lobbyist. All I'm saying is I have noticed that they are
more effective.
They can be helpful. The thing I would add there on the building relationships is it's really about education.
Yes.
There is very little, especially on these issues, malintent from anyone in elected office.
Yeah.
Most people think they're going in there to help the communities that we're talking about, and they don't know that we're not.
Okay.
Or they don't know where we're missing, or where the gaps are, or where people are hurting. And so I think it's really important to assume good intentions, even for people from different political backgrounds.
Yes.
And work on education as part of the relationship building. Build the relationship and educate them about what's going on, and educate them about what's going on in their communities with the people they know. So I would just add that piece to it.
That's right. I love it. Thank you so much. Last question I always ask everybody who joins us in the studio is a hack. Now, you're not a parent, as I know.
I'm not a parent.
Okay, you're not a parent, as I know. So most of the hacks are parenting hacks. So what is something that you know now, or something that you have learned in your advocacy journey that if you'd have known it 5 years ago, 6 years ago, would have saved you a whole lot of anxiety? It would have saved you a whole lot of time and effort, maybe had you bumping your head against a few less brick walls. Not from a parenting perspective, but from a maneuvering the system to get the outcomes that you need for the communities that you're representing. What is it that you know now that you wish you'd have known in 2012 when you kind of were nascent to the organizing advocacy space? What would you tell us as families at the intersection of race and disability working to advocate for our exceptional children? What hacks can you give us as an organizer who's familiar with the system?
So I'll give you the one of the biggest ones that is a everyday project for me. So I'm working on it, but I'm positive that it's right, which is that the personal matters more than you think.
Okay.
Which is to say, if someone feels slighted, if you insult them in some way, offend them in some way, they will take it, they will remember, and it will cost you legislatively. It will cost you substantively. And so if your eye is on the prize, which is the substantive change, the impact, you cannot afford the luxury of personal slights or of giving offense, even if in the moment it's so tempting or they're asking for it. Mm-hmm. Your job as an advocate is actually to take the deep breath and ignore it or rise above it, which is really hard to do. And you can watch me in committee, and I don't always do it, but I see how important it is. Mm-hmm. I got a call from a very powerful Republican in the legislature recently, and I'm not endorsing being so thin-skinned, but I'm giving it to you as a hack because it's the reality. Mm-hmm. Someone posted something, a complaint about him. And honestly, a pretty marginal complaint. But they tagged him in it.
Okay.
And it was another legislator. And because I serve as the minority whip and am in leadership in the Democratic caucus, he called me to express his frustration about it. And it doesn't matter whether that person was right or wrong on the substance to tag him in the post. It was the wrong move if your goal is to make progress and an impact on the issues you care about for the people and communities who need it most.
Okay.
Because now he will hold it against her for any legislation she brings on any issue. She just lost a vote, a powerful vote. Mm-hmm. Now, that is not how I legislate, right? That is we should be legislating on the merits. But what the hack I am giving people is that these are very sensitive individuals. Mm-hmm. And keeping your eye on the prize for making the change you want to make is always going to be more important than scoring that personal point. Mm-hmm. And I'm saying it out loud so that I remind myself as much as I am trying to remind others. Mm-hmm. But that stuff, and it matters in the reverse. People remember the handwritten note. Legislators remember that you remembered about their kids, or you know where they went to school, or you remember about their vegetable garden or whatever it is. Yep. So make it personal. And
it's kind of like the Maya Angelou quote about, people will not always remember what it is that you do or what it is that you say, but they'll always remember how you made them feel.
And it goes in for the better and for the worse. Yeah. And it has real legislative impact.
Got it. That's a good hack. Thank you, Rabbi Isaacsohn. We appreciate your time. Thank you for putting us on your very busy schedule, racing towards the end of the year.
There's nothing I love more than talking about organizing and how we get equitable education funding. So thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And thank you for taking the time to join us in the studio again for another conversation with the Intersection Collective. The Intersection Collective podcast is excited to bring you nuggets of hope, nuggets of joy and inspiration on what can oftentimes feel like a long, lonely journey of special education advocacy. Come back next time for more hope for your journey.